Everybody, welcome to your second video tutorial for week 2. So your first tutorial this week looked at performing a visual analysis or a formal analysis of a work of art, and then I wanted to talk now about how you put those works of art into context. You're going to be discussing this idea of putting works of art into their context a lot this term, and your instructor might be asking you questions about what makes this work of art part of its time period, how is this an example of this context, and so forth. And so this tutorial is just to sort of walk you through how that can happen. So what are we talking about when we say context and putting works of art into context? Basically, it's the full details or factors or influences that surround something, that happen around a work of art when it was created. What was going on in the world around it? What sort of forces or factors might have come into play when it was created? This could be things like what was happening just simply in history, what was happening in terms of style during the time period, or what was happening culturally, what kind of tastes or values were present at the time, what was happening economically or politically, what was happening in popular culture. Again, this sort of goes along with tastes and ideas of style, what was popular at the time, what was happening religiously within this culture. So all these elements or factors can be things that have an impact on the way a work of art is created. And again, we want to think about these works of art as not existing within vacuums. They were products of their time period. So we want to ask ourselves, how does a work of art reflect the ideals of the culture in which it was created? Or how do the visual details of a work of art express the features of its style or time period? Or in other words, what makes a work of art of its time? So when we talk about something being of its time, that's what we mean when we're saying putting it into context. So some examples. When we looked at the formal analysis example before, we looked at this ancient Egyptian sculpture, and I wanted to bring it back in here and think about how, after we do that formal analysis of it, looking at the visual details and the effects of those details, how we could then apply context to it. So the first thing we want to ask ourselves when we apply context is, what do we know about the culture, the values, and the beliefs of this time period? And then we want to ask ourselves, how can we see these beliefs, culture, values, and so forth reflected in this particular work of art? So again, it's sort of a two-step process. And here we're building off of what we did before in terms of just looking at what we see, and we're bringing in our research and our reading and our sort of richer, deeper understanding of the world in which this work was created. So some things we learn about this culture when we do our reading and our research. We learn more about the ancient Egyptian interest in the afterlife, the importance of permanence and structure in the afterlife, and that the people of ancient Egypt tended to worship and honor their pharaohs, their leaders, as if they were divine, as if they were godlike. So when we learn more about the culture that follows ancient Egypt, we can then start to think about, okay, how do we see some of these cultural elements reflected in this particular work here? Here we have a pharaoh and a queen together even after death, so it's a memorial marker to the pharaoh and his queen. And according to the ancient Egyptian idea of the afterlife, they will be together again after death. And they wanted to create something that was permanent and solid and still so that it would continue throughout the afterlife. So that importance of permanence that we see not only here on earth but in the afterlife spills over. And lastly, we talked before in our visual analysis about how these two works are not really portraits of these two individuals, but they give us a sense of the fact that this is a pharaoh and a queen, just enough detail to let us know it's a male and a female, and then with the other hints we get in the work, we know it's a pharaoh and a queen, but they're not shown to us as real human beings with all their flaws or warts and all, so to speak. Instead, we get the sense that these are ideal figures, and when this links back to the idea of the ancient Egyptians worshiping their pharaohs and their leaders just as they would a god, as if they were divine and ideal, this is why we can start to see how these figures were not necessarily represented as perfect portraits of what they might have really looked like, but more an ideal or divine idea of what they looked like. When we apply context to this other work that we looked at back when we did our visual analysis, for those of you in 202, moving ahead in future to the 17th century and Rembrandt, again we ask ourselves those two big questions. What do we know about the culture, the values, and the beliefs of this time period? and how can we see this reflected in this particular work. So when we do our visual and formal analysis just based on what we see here, we've already got some ideas going, but when we start to apply context, this is when we bring in our research and our reading and learning more what we can about this time period, 17th century. So the 17th century Baroque interest in the dramatic and emotional storytelling in art through color and lighting is something we learn when we study more about the culture and time period. There was a great interest in showing stories from the Bible and from mythology. And during the 17th century Baroque period, particularly in Holland, there was an interest in realism in figures and setting to really draw the viewer in. So we learn more about that generally speaking in terms of the context and culture of the period, but how can we see that reflected in this particular painting? Again, we always want to bring it back to the work of art. Well, we see rich colors and sharp contrasts of dark and light, the clouds in the sky versus the darker shadows to the right that we talked about before. Those help create that sense of drama. It's definitely a mythological story when we start to learn more about this work. It's the story of the abduction of Europa by the god of Zeus, who came down to the earth in the form of a bull. So that ties back to that 17th century interest in mythology. And we've got a naturalistic, realistic landscape. So we get the sense that we're looking at a real world. There's details in the leaves on the trees. The effect of the reflection on the water looks very realistic, as if we're actually looking at the world through a window instead of looking at it on a work of art on canvas. So this realistic landscape, and then the fact that Rembrandt puts the figures in contemporary dress. They're wearing clothing that people who lived during the time of Rembrandt would have worn. So it helps to get those viewers to feel connected to the work of art, that it's not just an ancient Greek or Roman myth from centuries before, but this could be something that could connect to them today in their modern period in the 17th century. And it shows emotion. So again, that interest in this period of getting the viewer drawn in to tell this story through the emotion and visual connections as well.